Okay, so I thought I would just give a rundown of the book through the table of contents. That way you can see a bit about what it's about just through directly looking at it. I'm sharing the screen of the PDF right now, and as you can see from the page count, it's a fairly sizable work. It's actually broken down into two books, with which are here together in the PDF. Book one, A New Foundation for the Study of Parables, and book two, starting in chapter 8, the Fables of Jesus and the Gospel of Luke. Now, if you don't have access to the book, you can, of course, ask your library to get it for you, to purchase it, or to get the ebook. Both books are printed together in the same volume, so it looks like this, decently thick, and it has very handy tassel as well, which I thought was a really nice touch. Um, so the reason to have two books is, first of all, the big issue with the ancient fable, namely that very few people know anything about it. Book one is essentially a standalone introduction to the ancient fable, geared for people that don't know anything about it, biblical scholars especially. And by the end of finishing just book one, these first 6, 7 chapters, you'll essentially know more about the ancient fable tradition than most professional classical scholars, who also generally have neglected this ancient genre. So in chapter one, the introduction, I introduced the problem, namely that Jesus, as far as historians can tell, is the first figure in recorded history to use the narrative parable, with any regularity. And that's problematic for several reasons. That's not really how genre tends to work. That's not usually how history works. You can't just invent a new genre. But again, this is sort of the reality that we have before us, is that we have apparently no record of anyone else around Jesus, before Jesus, using this narrative parable genre. Now, of course, the rabbis used the parable genre centuries after Jesus, but as even rabbinic scholars point out, there's still nobody at the same level as Jesus. So centuries later, yes, they're using it, but where are all the examples of prodigal sons, fishermen, shepherds, good Samaritans, and these kinds of stories? They're just basically essentially absent. And this is the problem that I intend to solve. And if you can't tell from the title of the book, the answer that I propose is the ancient fable. And I explain chapter after chapter about why narrative parables like the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the rich man and Lazarus, the judge and the widow, fisherman, treasure in the field, so on and so forth, why these are easily explainable if you know the first century fable. We have all kinds of stories just like this in the ancient fable collection and so on. So the concluding part of the chapter is looking at Adolf Eulachar. So Adolf Eulachar is often considered to be the sort of founding father of modern parable studies. And intriguingly, Eulachar also comes to a similar conclusion as me. He says that the majority of narrative parables are fables, like those of Aesop and Stesichorus. And so I sort of latch onto that category. Ultimately, Eulachar still decided to divide parables from fables, because he felt that fables were often vulgar and comic, whereas parables are supposedly lacking in humor and always talking about heavenly things. These sort of problems that Eulachar had with this, modern parable scholarship has completely abandoned. The idea that parables have to be always sincere, not humorous, that they can't be vulgar, and so on. So those distinctions that Eulachar made don't hold up, which brings me to the conclusion that indeed narrative parables and fables are identical. And when you start to look at the collections, when you start to look at the ancient fable, this becomes increasingly obvious. So in chapter 2, Fable First Principles, identifies some of the problems with why no one has, for example, argued this theory in more than 100 years or so. And one big issue has to do with the fact that modern people don't know much about fables anymore, and believe many myths about them. So one that the fable is children's literature, or that the fable is somehow a Greek genre as opposed to a Jewish genre, or that fables have to be about talking animals, for example, as opposed to realistic and about people. None of these things are true. In fact, we have some very interesting ancient testimony from Plato and Socrates to first century authors who talk about how people that try to distinguish animal fables from human fables are making silly distinctions. We have all kinds of fables about the regular lives of human beings, for example. And then in the second half of chapter 2, I introduce all the different important scholarly works written on ancient fables so that readers can actually follow up on this work and will be acquainted enough with the ancient fable material to do your own scholarship on this, for example. And then with chapter 3 and chapter 4, I start introducing the ancient primary literature, beginning first of all with the archaic period of ancient Greece. So we have fables going back as early as that. The Semitic world, of course, obviously, the fable is a Greco-Semitic genre, so we have references, fable examples from the Semitic world as well. Then we move on to classical period of ancient Greece, where we find that fables are used not simply as children's literature, but are being used by rhetors, used in education. There's a very interesting tradition about condemned wise men who utter fables as they're sort of being led to the gallows, including, I would argue, Jesus among them, but also Socrates. And then early traditions about Aesop. So if you know anything about fables, you might know the name Aesop. And Aesop, you believe it or not, is a character who is known already in the classical period. So very, very early tradition. And from very early on, Aesop is associated with fables. Then we sort of skim through the Hellenistic period, and then arrive at chapter 4, fable collections in the days of Jesus and the gospel. So right around the advent of the imperial Roman time, so right around the time of Jesus, we notice something of a renaissance of the ancient fable. This is when most of our ancient collections derive from, especially around the first century. So first is this actually collection up here, John Ryland's Papyrus 493, dated on papyrological grounds, paleography, to about 50 to 1 BCE. So again, right around the days of Jesus. Babrius, Phaedrus, the Augustana collection, and the life of Aesop. So you can ask yourself, have you ever heard of the author Babrius before? Have you heard of the fable author Phaedrus or the Augustana collection? If you haven't, then that's just fine because very few people have, but these are essential comparable texts to what's going on with Jesus's fables. Babrius was an author of a fable collection containing probably around 200 fables or so in the 1st or 2nd century. We're not sure exactly when. I would date him probably to the late 1st century. Phaedrus basically lived more or less identical time span as Jesus, so probably around 10 BC to around 30, 40 AD or CE. The Augustana collection is an anonymous prose collection of fables in Greek. This is a really tricky text to date because it's a very fluid text, but again, we're probably thinking right around 1st, 2nd century, somewhere in there, containing 250-ish fables right around the time of Jesus. And the life of Aesop. So this is just a quick thumbnail sketch of a ancient biography about the character Aesop, a suspiciously gospel-like text in many ways. This tells the story of Aesop, who is a deformed slave who ultimately is trying to win his freedom. He tells many fables along the way, about half of which are just normal human stories, human fables, and uses the same kind of forms as you'd expect Jesus to be using. Chapter 5 introduces the fable and the Greco-Roman educational system. And this is important, especially when thinking about the evangelists, because the evangelists are obviously educated authors writing in Greek. And I'm going through here at the different stages of education that they would have gone through, primary education, secondary education, and especially the progymnasmata. At each stage of the ancient educational system around the 1st century, fables appeared at every single level. So basically, if you could even write your name in Greek, it means that you will have studied fables as part of this. But especially once you get to the progymnosmata, this is preliminary rhetorical exercises. These are, if you want to become a trained author or a public speaker or a lawyer, you're going to be working with these and going through this system. And one of the first exercises in the progymnosmata is the fable. And so I discuss how authors like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and anybody else who is literate and writing in Greek would have learned fables, learned how to compose them, learned how to redact them, learned how to draw morals out of them, and so on and so forth. Basically, this chapter shows that this is not a missing genre that appeared out of nowhere with Jesus. This fable genre is something that everybody knew, any educated person knew. And therefore, the evangelists themselves could also be composing these kinds of stories for Jesus. The educational system is also very handy because this helps us with the definition of the fable. The fable is a highly theorized genre already in the ancient world, people talking about how you best define it and so on. And here is where we get a good definition from the first century, which is that fables are fictitious stories that give a picture of truth, and after which you make explicit a moral for them, which is basically exactly what we think of with narrative parables. And this is also the definition that a lot of modern fable theorists are working with as well. And also in this same area, the ancient theorists talk about whether it's useful to divide fables between those that are about humans and those that are about animals. The interesting thing is, first of all, they describe them both as different kinds of fables. But some authors, like Theon, an important first century author of Progymnosmata, basically says, again, that dividing them by the characters in them is kind of a silly distinction to make. In chapter 6, I jump ahead to the rabbinic literature, and I discuss the use of fables by rabbinic characters. And what's especially interesting is the terminology used for parable and fable is the same. There is one word in rabbinic Hebrew, basically, for parable and for fable, which is mashal. And so this is maybe an indication that they didn't see any distinction between these stories about humans and these stories about animals. We have many famous examples of characters employing fables, whether about humans or about animals. And in fact, we have a character like Bar Kapara, who is most famous for his fables, his parables, his meshalim. And he, I argue, is characterized by rabbinic texts as a kind of Aesop, drawing on a lot of traditions about Aesop. So here we even have a more explicit example of the rabbis, Jewish figures, using the fable materials. And then finally, the last chapter in book 1, the parable and the ancient fable, I synthesize all of this material that I've introduced, everything that you've learned so far, into how we think about narrative parables. And so one issue has always been the meaning of parabole. Parabole has an incredibly broad meaning in the Septuagint and even in the New Testament, and it's not at all coterminous with what we think of as parables, which has been kind of the fundamental issue. So here I look at the ancient rhetorical treatises, Aristotle, Absines, Trypho, and so on. And all of these ancient authors basically give a sense of parabole as a broad idea of comparison. In Aristotle, in fact, Aristotle describes the parabole right before describing the logos or fable. And the way that he describes a parabole, the examples that he gives, they're all basically one sentence long. They are not told in the past tense. They don't have a moral after them. Whereas the fables that he then goes on to describe and define do. And this is something that a lot of scholars have noticed, Eulicher, for example, but others since then have noticed that Aristotle's fables sound a lot closer to what we want with a parable. A lot of people have sort of scratched their head then at this and not really followed through on what this implies. And here I draw a conclusion about how these then fit together. I argue that the term parable is not a very helpful term at all, and in fact causes all kinds of confusion, in that narrative parables are fables. So I think I'll pause here. That's a pretty lengthy introduction to book one, and then I will jump into book two.